Every day, brave police officers risk their lives to keep us safe. But when they sign up to protect people, they're also signing up for something else, the unexpected. Sometimes, even during normal workdays, things happen that seem like they're from another world. Tonight, we're looking at 3 police officers whose lives changed after seeing things they couldn't explain. We start with a deputy in Iowa who promises he'll never go near the Cedar River again. Our first story comes from an officer who won't tell anyone his real name. He told researchers, "There will never be a report with my name on it." But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. For privacy, we'll call him Chris. Back in 2014, Chris worked as a deputy sheriff in Cedar Rapids. His regular patrol area covered the quiet factory area near Highway 30 and the Quaker Oats plant, the largest cereal factory in the world. Most nights were calm. He'd check parking lots, watch the levee, maybe stop a speeder. Nothing unusual until the call came in. Dispatch reported a drowning near the plant. A teenager was believed to have been pulled into a storm drain during heavy rain. Units were already searching the shoreline and drainage tunnels that led into Cedar Lake. Chris was assigned to the northern edge of the search area near the electric company storage yard, a place surrounded by trees, a bike path, and a wide concrete spillway built to prevent flooding from the river. He arrived just before nightfall. The air was heavy, still humid from the storm that had passed hours earlier. At first there was nothing, just the hum of insects, the flicker of distant lights from downtown. But as darkness came, the searchlights went out one by one, and Chris found himself alone by the water. He remembers crouching near the spillway, sweeping his flashlight over the brush, hoping for any sign of movement. Instead, he noticed something else, a faint red glow cutting through the trees. At first, he thought it might be taillights, maybe another police car turning around on a service road, but there were no roads here, and whatever that glow was, it wasn't moving away. It was coming toward him. Chris later said that the moment he saw the red glow, he knew it wasn't a reflection. At first, he told himself it had to be something simple. Taillights from a vehicle, maybe another deputy driving around on a service road. That made sense. The only problem was there were no roads here. The longer he watched, the clearer it became that the light wasn't fading. It was coming straight toward him. He called out once, "Sheriff's office," expecting to hear someone answer back. Nothing. The radio was quiet. No talking from nearby units. The glow dipped once behind the trees, then returned in the exact same line, steady and on purpose. Chris was patrolling near the Cedar River that night, assigned to the northern edge of the search area. The call had come after heavy rain. A 17-year-old had been pulled into a storm drain near the Quaker Oats plant, and crews were trying to find him before the current carried him farther downstream. It was the kind of search that could take hours. Deputies were spread thin along the bike path, spillway, and fence line behind the electric company yard. For the first hour, everything had been routine, cold, quiet, uneventful. But now, standing alone by the river, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was moving just beyond the beam of his light. He swept the flashlight left to right, slow and careful. On the ground, he noticed a line of marks pressed into the dirt, wider than boot prints and spaced unevenly like something heavy had passed through. He crouched to get a better look, then froze when the red glow blinked. 2 clear points this time, eyes. He later said they were too far apart to belong to any human head, and too high above the ground to belong to an animal on 4 legs. Whatever he was looking at, it stood upright. Chris drew a breath and said again, louder this time, "Unit on foot." Call it. Silence. A second later, a deep snort came from the same direction. Wet, guttural, followed by a long drag of air. He'd heard plenty of animals at night. Deer, coyotes, dogs from nearby farms. None of them sounded like this. The air moving in and out of those lungs was heavy enough to hear. He started to raise his radio to call it in, then stopped. What would he even say? Unidentified red eyes. He kept his thumb off the mic and shifted the flashlight to his left hand so he could draw his weapon. When the beam cut across the shape again, it outlined a shoulder, massive, round, and the top of a head that looked wrong for a man. The muzzle was long and narrow. The ears stood tall and sharp. In the white circle of light, the creature didn't flinch. It just watched him. Chris said later that the strangest part wasn't fear. It was how calm the thing seemed. Its chest rose and fell in slow rhythm like it had all the time in the world. It was sizing me up, he explained. That's what it felt like. He called out one more command. Let me see your hands. But the moment the words left his mouth, he realized how pointless they sounded. The arms he could see were thick, the forearms hanging low past the knees. The hands or claws were too long, the fingers ending in dark curves that caught the light. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost curious. Then it did something that made every hair on his arm stand up. It lifted its nose to the air and inhaled. Not a quick sniff, but a slow pull of breath through a wet muzzle, as if testing the scent of the man pointing a gun at it. Chris took a single step back, keeping the weapon down, but ready. The red eyes tracked him perfectly. The radio crackled faintly with static from another unit miles away. He ignored it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, like waiting for a decision neither one had announced. Then the creature shifted weight to its other leg, turned its head toward the darker part of the woods, and moved. Chris described the motion as too smooth for anything that big. It didn't lunge or stumble. It simply pivoted and disappeared into the brush in one clean glide. No snapping branches, no heavy footfalls, just gone. He held his stance, light and weapon fixed on the spot where it vanished. The breathing had stopped. The night sounded normal again. The water, the faint hum of distant traffic, the buzz of insects returning to their rhythm. He waited another 10 seconds, maybe 20, before lowering the gun. He said later that he wasn't sure whether he'd been standing there for half a minute or 5 full minutes. Time didn't feel right. All he knew was that the thing had left when it chose to. Chris stayed still a moment longer, listening for any sign it had circled back. Nothing. He eased backward along the trail, keeping the fence line at his shoulder, flashlight aimed at the trees. The feeling of being watched didn't lift. It just followed him at a distance, fading little by little until he reached the gate to the yard. At that point, he decided the search could continue without him on this side of the river. He stepped through the gate, keeping his eyes on the tree line until the cruiser's headlights framed his position. He climbed inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. He didn't drive off right away. He sat there for a few seconds, both hands on the wheel, gun still resting in his lap, breathing in short, controlled bursts, the way training had taught him. Then he put the car in gear and rolled toward the main road, the spillway disappearing behind him in the mirrors. Chris never forgot that last look, the moment when the 2 red points blinked out all at once, as if whatever owned them had simply turned its head and decided to leave. He didn't speak of it that night. Not to dispatch, not to any of the other deputies working the grid. He finished the shift on autopilot, checking in when required, answering calls with the same calm voice he'd always used. Inside, his mind kept replaying the scene. The red glow, the sound of air dragging through something alive, the way it moved without sound. When his shift ended, he went home, took off his uniform, and sat in silence at the kitchen table until daylight came. He tried to pray, then laughed at himself for even thinking about it. Whatever he had seen didn't fit in any category he knew. Human, animal, or something else entirely. By mid-morning, curiosity won. He drove back out off duty this time, telling himself he just wanted to confirm it was nothing. In the light, the area by the fence looked harmless. Short grass, muddy trail, normal, but when he walked toward the brush, he saw where the stems were folded flat. A trail of crushed weeds led straight into the trees, wider than a man could have made. In the soft ground near the trail, a few long marks sank inches deep. Not boot marks, not paws, something in between, spaced like steps from a 2-legged stride. He crouched once, studied them, then stood up and walked away. That was the moment he stopped arguing with himself. It wasn't imagination. It had been there. He never filed a report. He'd been around law enforcement long enough to know how that would go. Jokes, questions, maybe a mental health check. He decided silence was safer. The incident never reached paper, and no one in the department ever linked his name to any official statement. Weeks passed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 2 red points hovering in the dark, steady and patient. Sometimes he'd wake thinking he'd heard breathing outside the window, even though he lived nowhere near the river. After 6 months, he put in notice. The resignation form didn't mention anything unusual. It just said career change. His captain signed it without asking questions. He became a minister not long after, something quieter, steadier. People in town said the new pastor had the calmest eyes they'd ever seen. None of them knew those eyes had once stared into something they couldn't explain. When a researcher later contacted him for permission to share the story, Chris agreed, but only if his real name stayed out of it. "There'll never be a statement with my name on it," he told the man. "I saw what I saw, and that's enough." The researcher labeled the account Dogman Cedar Rapids 2014. Chris never used that word himself. He simply called it the thing by the spillway. He still owns the Glock he carried that night. It sits in a drawer beside his bed, cleaned and ready. The only change is the ammunition. One magazine carries hollow points tipped with silver. When someone once asked him if he believed that would help, he shrugged. "Maybe it won't, but it makes me sleep better." Today, the Quaker Oats plant still hums beside the Cedar River, and the same bike trail runs past the spillway where he stood. Families walk dogs there after work. Joggers pass under the streetlights without thinking about what might live in the woods beyond the fence. Chris says that's probably for the best. When people ask if he ever thinks about going back, he just smiles. "No need," he says. "Whatever it was, it left when it wanted to." Then he pauses as if hearing a sound far away and adds, "But I still make sure I'm inside before dark." Exactly what he saw that July night remains unknown. Some say it was a large animal standing wrong, light catching its eyes just right. Others believe it was something older, something that's always been there, moving along the rivers long before the towns were built. Chris doesn't argue either way. He just says it wasn't a person and it wasn't supposed to be there. And that's how his account ends. A veteran deputy turned preacher who still checks the locks twice and keeps one loaded magazine apart from the rest. He says he's not afraid, only respectful. "Fear freezes you," he tells his congregation. "Respect keeps you ready. If you drive past the Cedar River at night, you'll see the same water he once patrolled, calm and silver under the streetlights." The city hums as it always has, but in certain areas the woods grow thick and the trail narrows. And if you ever catch a flicker of red light where there shouldn't be one, remember his story and don't stay to find out what's watching. Our next account comes from another officer, this time in Wisconsin, who found himself staring at something that wasn't alive, but still moved on its own. In 2011, a sheriff's deputy named Kevin was finishing a long shift just outside the city of Burlington. It had been a quiet day, routine patrols, a few traffic stops, nothing out of the ordinary. As the sun went down, he pulled into a small gravel parking lot north of town to catch up on paperwork. The lot was empty, bordered on one side by marshland and on the other by a narrow strip of forest. It was the kind of place locals used to park before walking the footpath that curved through the woods. Kevin wasn't there to hike. He left the engine idling, headlights off, and opened his laptop on the passenger seat. The only light came from the faint pink still left in the western sky. The evening was still, cool and quiet enough to hear frogs chirping from the marsh. He'd been typing for maybe 10 minutes when he noticed the change. At first it looked like low fog rising off the water, thin coils of vapor snaking upward from the cattails. But fog doesn't move against the wind, and this didn't just rise. It rolled, spreading sideways across the marsh as if pulled by something unseen. Within moments the faint mist thickened into a solid mass of pale green haze. Kevin sat up, blinking hard. He knew this area well. There were no factories or drainage pipes that could release steam here. Nothing that would glow that color. He cracked the driver's window an inch and leaned closer. The air smelled normal. No smoke, no chemicals. Just that faint marsh scent of water and mud. Then he realized it wasn't just drifting anymore. The haze was moving directly toward him. His first instinct was to reach for the radio, but he didn't. He told himself to wait, to observe. It was probably just low fog reflecting light from somewhere, but the nearest road light was half a mile away, and whatever was glowing didn't flicker or fade. It pulsed like a heartbeat. The green mass crept closer until it reached the edge of the gravel lot. In the span of a few breaths, the mist surrounded his vehicle completely. The squad's headlights dimmed. The dashboard lights flickered. Kevin froze, one hand still resting near the ignition. He could feel a vibration in the steering wheel, not from the engine but from the air around the car. Within seconds, everything electric began to die. The in-dash computer went black. The portable radio cut out mid-transmission tone. The RPM gauge dropped to nearly 0 even though the engine was still running. Kevin's flashlight, left on the seat beside him, flickered once and died. The green haze pressed thick against every window until he couldn't see a single shape outside, just light. He thought about driving, but something told him not to. The car's power was draining so fast that he worried if he moved it might shut down completely, so he sat there in the dim glow, heart racing, trying to think like an officer. Observe, assess, wait. The seconds dragged on until they no longer felt like seconds. Later, he said it was as if time had gone strange. At first, he thought it lasted a few minutes. But when the haze finally began to thin, the sky outside wasn't pink anymore. It was pitch black. The sun had been gone for hours. As the mist retreated, it seemed to move with purpose. It didn't just fade into the air. It rolled away in a slow, careful wave, slipping back toward the marsh until it vanished among the reeds. The instant it cleared the hood, every piece of equipment in his cruiser came back to life at once. Lights brightened, radio crackled, and the engine's idle jumped back to normal. Even the clock on the dashboard blinked as though power had been cut entirely. Kevin sat there stunned. His first thought was that it had to be some kind of gas. Maybe methane caught fire somehow, or a reaction from rotting plants. But nothing about it fit. The light hadn't burned or shimmered. It had glowed evenly, cold and solid. And the way it moved, like it knew exactly where it was going, stuck with him more than anything else. He stayed parked for several minutes, afraid that turning the key would somehow draw it back. When he finally drove away, the car's engine felt sluggish, almost heavy, but it never stalled. By the time he reached the main road, everything was working again as if nothing had happened. At home, Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost time. His shift should have ended around 9. The digital clock on his nightstand read 10:15. He hadn't driven more than a few miles, and he couldn't account for the missing hour. The next morning, he mentioned the event quietly to another deputy. The man laughed, said it was swamp gas, a local joke around Burlington. Kevin didn't push it, but deep down he knew it hadn't been gas. Swamp gas doesn't drain batteries, and it doesn't move like it's alive. Kevin didn't talk about it again for months. He chalked it up to being tired, to late hours and imagination, but the image of that green haze never left him. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the way the mist had moved, like it had known what it was doing. He told himself he'd imagined the drained power, that maybe his car had just glitched, but deep down he didn't buy it. Then less than a year later it happened again. It was late evening, a clear summer night with no fog at all. Kevin had just pulled into another quiet lot, this one near the boat ramp at Pfizer County Park on the east side of Burlington. The spot overlooked Browns Lake. From there he could see lights from houses reflecting on the water. He was running radar, watching for speeders on the nearby county road when a faint green shimmer appeared over the lake surface. At first he thought it was just light from the houses or maybe a boat lamp cutting across the water, but it wasn't coming from any source he could identify. It was forming a pale glowing haze, the same unnatural shade as before, gathering low over the shoreline. Kevin leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He didn't want to believe it, but the color was identical. Soft, pulsing, almost intelligent. He shut off the spotlight and watched in silence. The green mist began to stretch and rise, taking shape above the lake, then rolling outward like a slow tide. It moved straight across the water, heading toward the small island in the center of Browns Lake. Kevin knew the island well. There was only one house on it, an old property built decades ago. The mist crossed the lake in a smooth, unbroken line, as if drawn to that house. When it reached the south end of the island, it paused, hovered for a few seconds, and then evaporated. Gone this time. It never came near his vehicle. His dashboard stayed bright, radio steady, no malfunctions. The air felt normal again. The entire event couldn't have lasted more than 2 or 3 minutes. He looked at his watch, checked the car clock, compared both. They matched exactly. Kevin knew what he'd seen wasn't a trick of the light. The glow had its own presence, controlled, measured, not random. He sat there long after it vanished, staring out at the rippling water, trying to piece together what could possibly behave like that. Later, When he recounted the experience, he said something that stuck with researchers. It wasn't fog and it wasn't smoke. It was something that had purpose. He tried to file a quiet internal note about it, just a mention of unexplained lights near Browns Lake, but before he could, he deleted the draft. He told himself it was better to leave it off the record. No one would take it seriously anyway. Weeks later, Kevin returned to the same boat ramp one afternoon. He wanted to see the area in daylight to convince himself the memory was exaggerated. Standing by the shoreline, he realized how open the space was. No factories, no exhaust vents, no way for colored vapor to form naturally. Even stranger, there were burn marks on the gravel near the waterline, small circular patches of scorched stone. He took photos but never shared them. When asked later why, he said, "Because nobody wants to believe cops can be scared." After the second encounter, Kevin started noticing things he hadn't before. Radios losing charge for no reason. Cell batteries draining after a few minutes near the marsh. Static bursts across frequencies when the air turned humid. He wasn't the only one. Other officers in the county later mentioned similar malfunctions, though none ever connected them to any light or haze. The story might have ended there, but Kevin kept digging. He checked maintenance logs for his cruiser from the night of the first event. Everything showed normal voltage levels except one entry. The onboard computer had recorded a 32-minute total loss of connection, even though the car's power had supposedly been on. When he showed that line to his supervisor, the man shrugged. "Glitch in the system," he said. "Don't lose sleep over it." But Kevin couldn't let it go. He read about pilots who'd reported glowing clouds that caused instrument failure. He found an archived report from the 1950s about something similar in Minnesota. Green glowing fog that shut down 2 fishing boats' engines. None of the stories had explanations that held up. The further he looked, the more he realized he wasn't the first to see something like it. By the time he retired, Kevin had accepted that he might never know what it was. "Some things aren't meant to make sense," he told one interviewer years later. That light, whatever it was, acted alive, but it wasn't. It just did what it wanted. He still keeps those photos in a drawer. Small dark images of the gravel lot, the water, the faint circular burns that no one else ever saw in person. Every so often he takes them out not to prove anything, but to remind himself it happened. Locals around Burlington still talk about strange lights over Browns Lake, especially on quiet nights when fog rolls low over the water. Most laugh it off. Kevin doesn't. He says the air there never feels right, like it remembers. Exactly what that green mist was remains one of those stories that sits between science and the supernatural. Maybe it was gas reacting with electric fields. Maybe it was something else entirely, something that doesn't belong in any report. Kevin never found an answer, but he doesn't need one. "You can't explain everything," he said. "You just hope it doesn't notice you twice." And with that, his file ends. 2 encounters, 1 man, and a question that still hangs over the marshlands of Wisconsin. If it wasn't alive, how did it know where to go? Kevin's story reminds us that not every threat comes with teeth or claws. Some are quieter, just light, air, and questions that don't go away. But our final account takes us north into the deep woods of Ontario, where the danger wasn't a glow in the sky or presence in the fog. It was something far older, something that walked right out of the forest itself. The man who told this story was a retired police officer from Toronto. For privacy, he asked to be identified only by his initials, JS, though we'll call him Jack. Before all of this, he'd spent 28 years in law enforcement. A disciplined, level-headed man known for his accuracy and calm under pressure. Off-duty, he was an avid outdoorsman. He'd been hunting since childhood, tracked moose and bear, and knew the Canadian wilderness better than most. That's what makes his story hard to dismiss. In October 2003, Jack traveled north for a week-long moose hunt near a small town called Searchmont, about 30 miles northeast of Sault Ste. Marie. He was joined by his brother-in-law. Both men were experienced hunters. The area was remote. Dense pine forest, steep valleys, No cell signal, no cabins in sight. Early that morning, they rode their ATVs down an old logging trail that eventually dead-ended in a clearing. When they reached the end, Jack's ATV got stuck in thick mud. After struggling to free it, the two men decided to split up. His brother-in-law continued uphill to scout another route, while Jack circled back toward an open patch he'd noticed earlier. It looked like a good place to call moose. Wide visibility, plenty of brush for cover and signs of fresh tracks. By 7:45 a.m., he'd set up there alone. The air was cool, still, and damp from overnight rain. Jack placed scent markers on nearby trees to attract a bull, then used a horn to make a few low moose calls. The forest answered with silence. He waited. Rain began to fall harder, forcing him to tuck his rifle in the storage case on the ATV behind him. He sat there listening to the soft drum of water on leaves, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. After about 15 minutes, something started moving toward him from the west. Slow, heavy, deliberate. He could hear it long before he saw it. Branches snapping, brush shaking. The dull thump of weight on wet ground. He assumed it was a bull. The sound of antlers scraping against trees confirmed it. Excitement surged through him, but so did frustration. His rifle was behind him in the case. Reaching for it would make noise. The animal was close. Too close. Through the brush, he finally saw it. A large bull moose, easily the biggest he'd ever seen. It rubbed its antlers against the trees, unaware of his presence. Jack decided to risk it. He turned, unlatched the storage lid, and grabbed the gun. The motion made a sharp metallic click, and the bull froze. In an instant, it bolted, crashing through the brush with thunderous force before vanishing into the valley. Jack sat there stunned. Moose rarely spooked that easily. They're cautious animals, but not like deer. They often hold their ground. Something had frightened it more than the sound of a latch. He waited another half hour, hoping it would return. But it didn't. When his brother-in-law radioed, Jack told him what happened and stayed in the clearing. The rain eased to a drizzle. Around 1:30 that afternoon, while eating lunch on the ATV, he heard another sound. Thuds, uneven but clear, coming from the slope behind him. He thought it was falling branches until one struck the ground close enough to make him flinch. He looked over his shoulder. Nothing. A minute later, another heavy object hit, followed by a low rustle. Someone or something was throwing from the ridge. Jack stood up, scanning the tree line, but saw only shadows between the pines. "Cut it out," he called, thinking maybe his brother-in-law had circled back as a joke. No answer. The woods were still. He climbed part way up the slope to investigate. That's when he noticed it. A long, weathered bone half buried near the base of a tree. It looked like a leg bone snapped clean in the middle, moose by the size of it. He'd hunted enough to know, but it hadn't been sawed or cut. It had been broken by force. He stared at it, then froze at the sound of movement again. This time closer, heavier from the valley where the moose had run earlier. Slow, measured footsteps. Jack raised his rifle, heart hammering. A shape emerged between the trees about 40 yards away. At first he thought it was a man, tall, broad, walking upright. But the proportions were wrong. The arms hung too low, the shoulders too wide. The figure moved with a rolling gait, swaying slightly as it stepped out of the brush. It paused, gripping a tree trunk as thick as his forearm, and turned toward him. In that brief moment, Jack saw it clearly. It wasn't wearing clothes. Its body was covered in dark, wet hair that clung to its frame. Muscles rippled beneath the matted fur, defined, powerful, inhumanly built. The head was shaped like a man's, but broader, the face flat with deep-set eyes and a short, wide nose. It looked straight at him. Jack froze, rifle half raised, afraid that any movement would trigger whatever this was. The creature stood still, chest heaving slowly as though curious but cautious. Then without warning, it crouched and vanished into the underbrush in one fluid motion. The silence that followed was absolute. Jack stayed locked in place for almost an hour, scanning the ridge, listening. Nothing returned. No birds, no wind, just rain dripping from leaves. When he finally climbed onto his ATV, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He rode back to camp and found his brother-in-law already there. The man said he'd heard a strange howl echo through the valley, a deep, drawn-out sound that faded into something like a cough. Jack didn't mention what he'd seen. Not yet. That night, sitting by the fire, he tried to convince himself it had been a trick of the light. But the shape, the muscle, the way it moved, those weren't shadows. He didn't sleep much. The forest outside felt alive in a way it never had before, and not in a good way. He woke up before dawn, long before the others stirred. The fire was cold, the air sharp, and fog hugged the ground like smoke that refused to rise. Every sound felt too close, the drip of water from pine needles, the creak of the tent fabric. He hadn't planned to go back to the clearing, but the thought wouldn't leave his mind. He needed to see it in daylight to know whether it was real. By sunrise, he was back on the ATV, heading down the same trail he'd sworn not to ride again. The forest looked clean, almost peaceful, washed silver by early light. But when he cut the engine and stepped off the path, that feeling died instantly. The air was still, not quiet like morning calm, quiet like something was listening. He reached the clearing and stopped. The mud near the valley had dried just enough to hold shape. And there it was, a line of deep marks running parallel to where the moose had stood the day before. Each was long, wide, spaced evenly apart, like steps from something tall walking upright. They weren't hoof prints and they weren't boots. Jack crouched, touched one of the indentations. The edges were crisp. The ground was otherwise untouched. That meant whatever had walked there had done so after the rain had stopped. Sometime after he'd fled. His throat went dry. He backed up toward the ATV, scanning the tree line, the ridge, the valley. Nothing moved. The forest was empty. Too empty. He climbed on, started the engine, and didn't slow down until he reached camp. His brother-in-law looked up from the fire, surprised. "Thought you were done for the trip," he said. Jack just nodded and started packing. They left an hour later. No discussion. No second attempt at the hunt. The drive back to the highway was silent. For most of it, Jack kept glancing at the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see movement between the trees. Back home, he didn't tell anyone for days. When he finally did, it was his wife who heard the full story first. She didn't laugh. She just said, "You saw something. You don't have to name it." It took nearly a year before Jack shared the details with anyone else. He contacted a researcher who specialized in wilderness sightings. The man met with him, verified his service record, checked the hunting permits, and even visited the same site near Searchmont. What he found matched everything Jack described: snapped branches, strange marks in the earth, and a patch of brush that looked like something massive had barreled through. Jack didn't want his full name used, but the researcher labeled the file Ontario 2003, Officer Witness. In his notes he wrote subject credible, trained observer, no motive for lying. When asked years later if he believed what he saw was Bigfoot, Jack shook his head. "I don't believe in names," he said. "Whatever it wasn't a man, and it didn't need me to believe in it to exist." He still hunts, though never alone and never in that region again. He keeps to the southern forest now. Thinner woods, shorter shadows. Sometimes he says the silence still follows him. When the wind dies, when birds stop mid-song, it all comes back. The sound of branches snapping, the slow weight of footsteps moving through mud. The researcher once asked him what scared him most. Jack said it wasn't what it did. It was what it didn't do. When pressed, he explained, "It could have come closer. It didn't. It chose to stop. That means it decided what happened that day, not me." For years afterward, locals around Searchmont reported distant howls echoing through the valleys, long, low, and mournful. Some said wolves, others said wind between the ridges. Jack didn't argue. "You can believe whatever makes you feel safe," he told them. He went back once many years later to visit friends who owned a lodge near the same highway. From there, the ridge was visible in the distance, a dark line of trees under the morning haze. He stood at the porch, looked out toward it, and said quietly, "It's still out there." When asked in an interview if he'd ever want to see it again, Jack smiled slightly. "No, once was enough," the interviewer pressed. "Do you think it was trying to scare you?" Jack shook his head. "No, I think it was warning me." He still keeps his rifle close when he camps. Still listens for changes in the woods, but he says he isn't afraid anymore. Fear means you think you have control. I don't, not out there. That's how his story ends. A man who spent his life enforcing order, brought face to face with something that didn't follow any rule he knew. A creature that left no proof. Just prints that shouldn't exist and silence that still lingers whenever he closes his eyes. If you ever find yourself deep in the Ontario backwoods and the world around you suddenly stops, no birds, no wind, no sound, remember what Jack said. It might not be gone. It might just be watching. 3 officers, 3 different stories, each one trained to see clearly, to separate fear from fact, order from chaos, and yet each one walked away with something no amount of training could explain. A deputy in Iowa who faced red eyes in the dark and left the force for peace. A sheriff in Wisconsin who watched a living mist drain the life out of his cruiser. And a veteran in Ontario who met something in the forest that shouldn't exist but did. Different places, different years, but the same truth runs through them all. Even those sworn to protect and serve aren't safe from the unknown. Maybe these stories aren't proof of the supernatural. Maybe they're just reminders of how much we still don't understand about our world, our senses, or what shares the dark with us. For every logical explanation, there's always something that refuses to fit neatly inside it. Some officers spend their careers chasing suspects, others chasing answers. But for the ones in these accounts, the chase ended the moment they realized the thing they were looking for was already looking back. So if you ever find yourself driving alone at night, passing the quiet edge of a forest or the still surface of a lake, look out the window once just for a second. And if you see something staring back, glowing red or green or something else entirely, remember you're not the first to see what isn't supposed to be there. Because even in a world ruled by laws, there are still places that answer to none. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments which story unsettled you most. The red eyes, the green mist, or the shadow in the pines. And if you enjoy hearing the true accounts of those who serve on the front line between order and the unknown, you know what to do. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never forget what waits just beyond the light.